Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. Welcome to all listeners, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at CyberSauna. Non-profit organizations, or NPOs, play a crucial role in our well-being. In many parts of the world, they're a major source of education, healthcare, social services, and more. And while they're not in it for the money, they remain a target for cyber attacks just like other organizations. Why is this the case? What can and should be done about it? Today we're joined remotely by Adrien Ogee, Chief Operating Officer for the CyberPeace Institute, a non-governmental organization that helps defend the security, dignity, and equity of people in cyberspace, and Heikki Stark, a security consultant with F-Secure who recently won an award for his work with the CyberVPK Community Cyber Response Force, which helps providers of critical services fight and recover from cyber attacks. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, non-profit organizations face a number of operational challenges, just like any other organization out there. Where does security rank for these organizations?
Well, I think it highly depends on the NPO and what kind of data they are actually storing. I was thinking about our KyberVPK that we don't actually have any kind of client registries, and the most sensible data that we have is actually our communication, the internal communication and the communication with our clients. And I think that having more data to protect requires a lot better security controls. So I think our organization differs a little bit from the usual non-profitable organizations, but it highly depends on what they actually do.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Heikki. It really depends on the risk exposure of the organization. NGOs that have a lot more sensitive data than others because of the nature of their mission, right? For instance, if they operate in conflict areas or if they manage patient health information or research information around vaccines, like we've seen in a project we launched about 2 years ago. Those organizations are much more likely to be targeted, just like in the private sector or in government organizations that hold more sensitive data. I think an other consideration to have as well is the level of IT penetration in the activities of the NGO or NPO. And that's something that has changed fairly drastically in the last decade or a little bit more in the humanitarian space in particular. And so the level of IT penetration just brings more risk exposure and allows for new types of attacks. So certain NPOs will not be so relevant for cyber criminals or certain governments, but others will be a lot more. And so they need to, just like any organization, define what is their exposure and come up with the right controls to protect their data, protect their operations, protect their stakeholders, beneficiaries in the case of NGOs, etc.
Sure, okay. What about just the nature of being a non-profit organization? Does that mean that their security needs differ from businesses or governments or other organizations like that? What are the differences for an NPO?
I think what's interesting with the non-profit organizations is the asymmetry in many cases between the level of sophistication of some of the threats that they can face versus the level of investments and basically controls that they can put in cybersecurity, which makes it somewhat difficult for many NGOs to secure themselves properly. But when it comes to comparing them to the private sector or governments, I think that we shouldn't differentiate that much, because at the end of the day, a lot of NGOs are small, medium enterprises. It's true that they operate in a non-for-profit environment, but at the end of the day, the systems that they use are very similar to other SMEs. The only difference is really the end client that they're serving. And I think that there was perhaps in the NGO space for a long time the belief that because of the social mission they had, they wouldn't be targeted. But that has completely changed in the last decade. We're seeing attacks against all sorts of NGOs that have the most noble missions out there. But there's little difference, at least from an enterprise standpoint, in terms of NGOs and other organizations of a similar size. I think perhaps one slight difference will be that when NGOs grow in size, unfortunately, their cybersecurity capabilities do not necessarily match that growth. whilst in the private sector, you will see that happening. And perhaps another last interesting difference will be that when organizations in the private sector or the public sector offer critical services, in many countries in the world, in particular in the Western world, they tend to enjoy the statuses of critical infrastructure operators, which NGOs today do not enjoy. And as a result, they cannot access some of the resources accessible to critical infrastructure operators, like a national CERT, like the protections from the defense ministry or the host nation and things like that.
I think you're already sort of touching on the topic I'm really trying to get at here is like, are there threats out there that are specific to NPOs? Like are they facing the same adversaries as other organizations? Or are there, what I'm hearing you saying is that their situations might be a little bit different from businesses.
Yes, I think the motives basically that attackers have for targeting NGOs can differ, right? If you look at purely financially motivated cybercrime, then the motives will be the same going after an NGO or a small company, right? The ethics of the attackers may be different, but at the end of the day, the motives will be the same, right? Stealing money and the amount of money that criminals can make by going after NGOs is high. We've helped an NGO called Roots of Peace operating out of the US, but helping Afghan farmers. They were stolen over $1 million in funding, right? Save the Children was stolen 800,000 pounds in funding, and other organizations are being ransomed, even though they have a very social mission. But then if you look at NGOs that operate in a slightly more politicized space, in particular in conflict regions. If you think of the International Committee of the Red Cross, for instance, who are often the first to enter a conflict zone and the last to leave, the motives of attackers to go after them tend to be somewhat different than going after a private company to try and steal money. So there's a lot more politics involved, sometimes religious reasons, etc. But this differentiates a little bit the nature of the attacker that you're facing. That being said, the nature of the threats, the attack vectors used, are fairly consistent with that of what we can find in the rest of cyberspace, bearing in mind that due to the limited investments in cyber in the NGO space, attackers seldom need to leverage very advanced zero days or rent very complex ransomware infrastructures to get to their objective, right? Many times it's just finding a leaked password that has been reused, for a couple of years and using that to insert themselves in their network, or using an Active Directory on-prem, that is legacy systems that hasn't been patched for a couple of months or a couple of years, which you tend to find a little bit less, at least in the Western world, in the private and public sectors.
And like you said earlier, that I remember you saying that basically the bigger the organization, the earlier they are targeted by attackers. So if you're starting to think about the Red Cross as an organization, it's a global organization, and it would be just a real big surprise if they didn't get any kind of cyber attacks at all, because they have a so wide range of risks that they are taking, since they are working like in third world countries where lots of big governments are actually trying to exploit as well.
Yeah. So going after the money these organizations might have, even though it's not as much as businesses, makes sense to me. But what other resources do they have that attackers would want to target, like in terms of like maybe, I don't know, data or I don't know, even infrastructure?
Yeah, me and my colleagues at KyberVPK, we were actually thinking quite a lot about the data that NPOs might have. And we were thinking that if we're starting to value the risks and the worst case scenarios that NPOs that are not so wealthy, you could say, what kind of scenario would be the worst case scenario? Because it might not be the loss of business or anything, or having an impact on their business continuity. Of course, how data-oriented the organization is versus a highly funded business, the scenario is quite different.
There's an example that's quite recent, right? The International Committee of the Red Cross was targeted by cyber criminals a couple of weeks ago. A program called Restoring Family Links was attacked, and so personal data of, I think it's 500,000 people, migrants, whose families have been dislocated due to displacements or migrations, has being stolen and is currently being sold, monetized by attackers. This type of data, is quite sensitive. and it's of interest to certain governments, for instance, who may want to see where certain people of interest are. There's potentially double, triple, even extortion mechanisms at play, where even some of the migrants could be contacted by the attackers, saying, we've got your data, we can sell that to a government. Maybe you can give us a bit of money instead, and we won't give out your data, which is something we've seen a lot happening in the case of ransomware attacks against hospitals during the pandemic. So there's several ways in which attackers can monetize this type of sensitive data. During the pandemic, we've also worked with NGOs that were operating in the vaccine research space, NGOs that were operating in the disinformation space. And so they may be targeted not for their funds or the sensitive data that they hold about their beneficiaries, but they may be targeted simply because of the nature of their operations, right? Because of the stories that they will uncover, reveal. You'll see this happening a lot in the human rights space as well, where NGOs operating in that space will be targeted just for their operations. That leads to threats, unfortunately, that go outside the boundaries of cyberspace and, have very serious physical consequences, which is part of the reason why our institute was actually set up, is to draw that connection between cyber attacks and impact on human life, which is something is not talked about enough, but is very present today. You think about the attack I mentioned around the International Committee of the Red Cross. You start in the digital world, you end up in the physical world. As a cybersecurity professional, I'm really keen on avoiding cyber attacks impacting human life, as we've seen happening in the last few months and years.
No, certainly, but there's like a scary asymmetry here, where there's an organization who just wants to do good and help, for example, displaced people, but at the same time there's, state security services that have an interest in displaced people. Either they want to track them, or because wherever you have displaced people, you have the opportunity, they're poorly documented, so you have the opportunity to create new identities for your undercover operatives or things like that. So, there's this little NPO who just wants to do good, and then they're faced with this, state security apparatus and all their cyber services. So it's a very scary asymmetry.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in that kind of a risk scenario or attack vector, that usually the other side, the attacking party, isn't that much driven by ethical choices at that point anymore.
Yeah, you're spot on, Heikki. And I think that's also part of the theory of change at the CyberPeace Institute that revolves around the notion of accountability. And it's the idea that as anyone steps onto the digital space, whether it's a nonprofit organization, it's my children, your parents, or our friends, or a CEO or a head of state, everyone has a role to play and everyone has responsibilities. And NPOs play a fantastic role in improving the state of the world, but they also have responsibilities. In particular now, when they're exposing the data and potentially the livelihood of their own beneficiaries, the vulnerable populations that they protect, they have a responsibility in protecting this. The difficulty here is that how can they protect their data, their digital infrastructure, when it costs so much to do so, and when the private sector is just always going to be able to pay more for cybersecurity services than the non-profit sector. So there's a key challenge here that is, not just intellectually interesting, but is actually a little bit concerning. How do we solve that challenge to make sure that we are protecting the most vulnerable? If not, how can we even talk about cyberpeace or the future of cyberspace when we know that the most vulnerable are at threat and we cannot address that?
Let's talk about this a little bit. We've been talking about different types of organizations like the Red Cross and organizations helping displaced people. These are worthy goals. I'm sure we can all get behind. There's other types of NPOs out there whose goals may not be as universally lofty. And you touched upon a great point that, cybersecurity experts in general are professionals who get paid to provide their knowledge and skills for companies out there. And we do it for free in the case of NPOs, but not for other organizations like the other small and medium-sized enterprises out there. What do you think about this?
On our side, the way in which we look at this is that we think that certain cybersecurity services should definitely be paid for. It's a costly space, it's a competitive space, it's a difficult career, and so it's just not scalable to do all this always for free. So there always needs to be, we think, an element of exchange of value between services provided and something received back. With our program, the CyberPeace Builders at the CyberPeace Institute, we're trying to play around that notion of exchange of value. And what we're able to do for only a couple of hours per volunteer per year. So we're not, replacing a cybersecurity offer from the private sector to help NGOs. We're just providing a little bit of a push. But we're basically telling volunteers, get out of your traditional day for a couple of hours a year and come and give a hand to that NGO, which has a humanitarian mission, and so a universal mission, to appeal to what you were saying earlier, Janne, and help them secure their systems so that they don't fall for a cyber attack, and if they have, so they can harden their security and not be victimized again. When it comes to incident handling, we found this model to be challenging. It's difficult to ask volunteers to come up in the middle of the night and do something and to provide some kind of SLA, right, service level agreement. And so we're not doing that. We've decided consciously early on not to provide incident response. It doesn't mean that NGOs do not have incident response needs. They do. And when they do, in our opinion, they need to turn to either the private sector or other NGOs that may be able to help. And Heikki, I think you guys are doing that. So could come to you and others. But we also think that this calls for a bigger discussion with their donors, because the key of the issue there is not that NGOs do not have money. The humanitarian sector raises about $30 billion annually. The entire NPO economy is around $1 trillion. So there is money. It's just that this money is prioritized for what is called a front office, so activities on the ground. There's this notion of indirect cost policy that donors impose, NPOs, asking them to spend, 9 cents of a dollar, helping children in one particular region, which is in line with the social mission of NGOs. But what we're trying to do through our programs at the CyberPeace Institute is to get enough data so donors realize that in order to protect children in a particular region or impoverished women or any vulnerable community, they need to protect their systems too.
I've seen some NPOs in crisis areas that have like a reasonable grasp of their physical security, because that's something tangible, something that they can see around them, but maybe not so much about cybersecurity. Do you think it's a problem because it's not tangible, you can't see cyber?
Yeah, there's definitely an element, of mystery around cyber attacks and unknown, and it's difficult for people to realize the extent to which a cyber attack can be felt physically. I've been in the crisis management space in cybersecurity for about 15 years, and you talk to any cybersecurity professional that has gone to a cyber crisis, and you can see in their body language how physical, how physiological even they have felt these events, right? But until you've gone through that situation, you don't develop those kinds of physiological symptoms and muscle memory. And so it's very hard to understand how physical that can be. That being said, organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross are thinking about these issues. How do we make this so apparent as well? Because if you probably remember from, movies or being in the field, you'll see the Red Cross or the Red Crescent visible on particular cars or hospitals and things like that. So how can you make that notion as well of social good and humanitarian mission apparent online? Could you have some equivalence there? So I know the RCRC is thinking along these lines and trying to find solutions, but it gets very tricky when you actually think about the technologies behind and the capability that attackers have to hide behind different sorts of layers, both technically and physically, in countries which will protect some of their activities. So it's definitely not as simple as painting something in a car and preventing or putting walls up there to prevent rocket launchers or grenades.
Right.
Or
yeah. Well, talking from a Finland perspective, of course, that we have a kind of a high level of security in NPOs to some extent, but of course we don't see rocket launchers on their walls or anything. But what we've seen actually is the information security orientation varies wildly between the NPOs and how they can actually respond to these incidents that we've been talking earlier. For example, sometimes the line between information security and data privacy can be very blurry, and they are actually quite hard discussions that they have to go within the organizations. And talking from a perspective of doing the easiest thing, and from my perspective, even as an information security specialist, I would say that the easiest thing would be just to neglect them altogether, but that's going to burn my hand at some point later on. It will come back to me at some point. And what I've actually noticed that asset management is really, really hard for NPOs and businesses altogether.
Sure.
But what I've actually seen lately is that NPOs have started to question their level of security, and that has brought a positive vibe to the communities and organizations that we've been talking with, that they're actually actively asking for help from us. And we are really glad to be helping organizations that are actually asking for it and not coming to us asking and begging for help. And if we don't have a volunteer who's ready to help them, then we can't really do that for them. But it's a lot easier to start doing the helping work before there's an incident.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are these companies dealing with? Like in your experience, what are the most common security challenges that NPOs are facing? Are they the same as businesses, or what's typical for an NPO, and how prepared are they for these issues?
In our experience through the CyberPeace builders, it's fairly interesting because one could assume that a low level of maturity in most NGOs, and there is definitely some NGOs which have such limited budgets that they, for instance, literally asked us, could they outsource their cybersecurity to our volunteer program, which we obviously said no, that is not the intent of that program, and you need to invest enough so that it makes sense. But we do see that general security assessments and just figuring things out. Heikki, you were mentioning the difficulty of asset management. And, when you've prioritized your front office for decades and you've started using applications and tablets and phones, and you have all sorts of systems interconnected, and you don't even know what you have, then, talking about cybersecurity is like talking about rocket science.
Exactly.
Right? First, you need to talk about IT. You need to have IT discussions, and then you can move on to data protection, cybersecurity, 2FA, and whatnot.
Yeah, and even in the smaller NPOs, you might actually see the persons or the volunteers using their personal devices, and that's when thinking about a business IT perspective, that's a nightmare to handle.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, and I was rather surprised by this, we've seen a number of NGOs that have an influx of staff coming from the private sector in their cybersecurity, IT departments, digital transformation departments, who demonstrate a level of preparation that I haven't seen in many corporate environments. So exercises, there's an NGO we talked to who organizes monthly phishing competitions, and they hand out prizes to people who, end up first, and how can you say that? Nice emails to those who who click on the wrong links and things like that. So there are NGOs out there that are taking leadership in cybersecurity, and I think that's a very interesting idea because it shows that it's possible. It is possible. Cybersecurity today has this connotation of an expensive field, and it's true. Some technological investments are expensive, and there are good reasons for that. But there are also a variety of tools and processes and behaviors that can be implemented inside an organization that are free. That you just have to know about them. You have to invest in them, prioritize them, know how important they are, and there comes the role of the CEO of an NGO or the board or the leadership team, basically, to really allow everyone to invest enough in cyber. So it's a lot about leadership at the end of the day.
Even if you do all that work in this day and age, like some sort of a data breach or something like that happening is almost inevitable anyway. So, knowing that, what is sort of your advice to NPOs? Sort of what sort of level of capability, what sort of level of response should they be capable of mastering?
And I think that the level of response that they should be able to get is actually the best response they can actually muster on their current situation. Because
But what does that mean? Like, what should I aim for?
from my point of view, you have to start thinking this before the incident happens, before you can actually think about. I think that if you haven't done any kind of risk management before, it's a really, really bad situation to start doing any kind of response to the incident itself. When thinking about if you don't know what your worst case scenario is, then you are actually having a hard time to take the steps on mitigating the incident to that level that it isn't that big of an issue anymore and starting to recover the normal operational level that you had. For example, if you don't know what's happening and you don't know what your worst case scenario is, then you might not actually know where to get some help in that situation. For example, you might have to go to the police to ask some help. And if you don't know when to get that help or at what point or what you are actually doing, then it's a really hard time for you to get back to the normal operation, if I answered to your question at all.
No, you did. And is that, Adrien, how you approach it, some sort of from a threat modeling point of view? Like, what are the threats you're facing? What's your worst day gonna look like?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously want to do some scenario planning and think about, worst case scenarios and plan for that. I think in crisis management, we always say that plans are useless, but planning is essential. Which gives the idea that you really want to be thinking about what's happening, what can happen, and I think that's what Heikki was saying there. There's also this famous quote from a Prussian field marshal called Helmut von Moltke that goes, "Experience is a good school, but the fees are high." And so you don't want to learn, if you can, you don't want to learn by experience. So it's much better to exercise. So one of the things I've spent a good decade doing in my career is training organizations so they can develop that kind of muscle memory that you get when you go through a real life situation, an accident, at home or anything, a car accident. You don't want to have a car accident to know how to react in a car accident, right? So that's why, you have prevention campaigns, you put your seatbelt and things like that. When it comes to cyber attacks in an NGO context in particular, if you consider the potential sensitivity of the data, potential personal nature of the data, as we have discussed around the recent attack against the International Committee of the Red Cross, there's first and foremost a duty of due diligence. And that ties with the notion of accountability. When you hop on cyberspace, when you transform your organization digitally, you want to make sure that you've done what you had to do to protect the data. And so the very first thing in the case of a data breach is actually to demonstrate that you've done that to your stakeholders, your donors, your beneficiaries, your governments in the countries where you're present. And so there's obviously this notion of due diligence, but a notion of communication as well. In the case of those data breaches, you absolutely want to communicate. You want to be transparent. You want to inform people what is at stake. If their data has been leaked, what may happen to them. So you need to take early steps there, for just, good reasons because it's the right thing to do. But also for regulatory reasons, right? It's not because you're an NGO or an NPO that you operate under no legal framework whatsoever. In Europe, we've got GDPR. In other countries, you've got data protection regulations as well. And when data leaks and you don't say anything about it, you're subject to hefty fines or,
exactly.
Closing down.
If as a volunteer you don't do your due diligence, you might end up in jail at some point.
What about the people whose data these organizations are handling, and that when their data gets compromised, what should these sort of clients or dependents of these NPOs, what should they do?
Well, after the big data breach in 2019, which came public,
the Vastaamo case, which made
exactly,
global news.
That one.
Yeah.
After that, in Finland, we've seen lots of memory lists and checklists on what you should do. But when thinking about smaller NPOs, that as an individual who is using their services, you can actually ask them what was leaked. And for example, if your phone number leaked and you think that it will bring you some sense of security if you change that phone number. After that, I've always said to the victims of this breach that if that helps them a little bit better to sleep at night, just go for it. It's a small task to do, but a really annoying one. But if it helps you to get some sense of security, just go for it. I wouldn't hesitate for a moment at that point. But if the NPO doesn't know what has leaked, then you should, as an individual, prepare for the worst. That you might have to change your passwords if you were reusing it somewhere. But if you have done the best you can regarding the security of yourself, and if your address, for example, has been hidden and now it has leaked, then it's a bad place to be, of course. But you have to prepare for the worst at that point.
Yeah, I second that. I think there's nasty level of asymmetry when that happens to you, because you gave your data to a big organization thinking that they'd secure it. And here you are with your data in the open, not really knowing what is a threat. So I think that trying to level that level of asymmetry to bring it to an acceptable level is paramount, and trying to understand, as Heikki was explaining, what is the type of data that has been leaked? What does this mean in terms of risk exposure to you, right? If your phone number has leaked, what can happen to you, right? Can people subscribe to services using your phone number? Can they try and send you malware through your phone number? Things like that. So you may want to change your phone number. That may be an appropriate response. But I think it's mostly like trying to reassure yourself of what happened, because I don't want to sound dismissive, but some of the data that is sometimes leaked ends up being data that is already somewhat public. And so there's huge amount of fear that is created, and that people that do not understand what has leaked may lead to have. And actually understanding what is happening, what has happened, can help you reduce that amount of fear and take you to take better decisions. It's our role in terms of cybersecurity professionals to give that advice, because we can't expect everyone to understand precisely what it means when your LinkedIn password has leaked. Helping folks to adapt, to respond is paramount. And I think in the case of Vastamo, there was quite an exemplary response in terms of victim support, providing assistance, letting people voice their concerns as well. And that's not something we've seen in every data leak in the past. So good lesson there.
Absolutely. So let's say I'm the person responsible for cybersecurity, or I feel I'm responsible for the IT hygiene and cybersecurity at my NPO, and I have some concerns. I feel there may have been some sort of intrusion or breach or an incident like that. What should I do? Who do I contact? Where do I go for help?
Well, I just want to point out one amazing community project that we have in Finland. It's actually maintained by Juho Jauhiainen, where he gathered all the DFIR consulting firms who are providing DFIR services, and it's available at the dfir.fi. There's a good list, and I really want to think that cybersecurity is teamwork. And if you would call any of those companies, I really want to think that this is true, that the first phone call, of course, is free. And if they decide that you as an NPO might not have the budget to use their services, but they are able to provide you with the next step on if you should contact Traficom in Finland, or if you could come to the KyberVPK and ask our help or anything. I really want to wish that they aren't that money hugging and they will provide some kind of help, just a little bit.
What about the international stage, Adrien?
Yeah, so there's numerous routes. For starters, I remain convinced that if an NPO is facing an incident and needs a swift response, that is costly, because you're asking people to change their priorities, to drop down tasks that they may have that may actually come against a fee, and to prioritize your activities. And I do see that this requires a level of exchange of value, and more often than not, that's money. There are some services, depending on the nature of your NGO. If you're a human rights defender, for instance, there are other NGOs that offer free cybersecurity advice, even in an incident response fashion, like Access Now or Amnesty International. It's part of their mission to do that, and they're fast to respond, and they do really help. When it comes to enterprise NGO security, if you're 10 people NGO, 20 people NGO, and you need help to educate your staff, you need help to harden your security, that's where a program like the CyberPeace Builders comes into play. So we leverage volunteers from the private sector to provide this type of advice for free. The exchange of value there is that the volunteers get exposed to a very different reality than theirs. They get obviously to contribute to making cyberspace safer, which appeals in general to everyone in cybersecurity. And it's contained, right? It's a couple of hours a year. The scope is fairly defined, so it's doable, it's manageable, right? And then there are other routes that NGOs may consider, depending on their size, depending on their statuses. They absolutely can try and get some help from the government. Depending on which country they are, if they're on good terms with the government or not. I know that the United Nations has a program to help particular NGOs, in particular those that fit within the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations, the UICC, their International Computing Center, provides at-cost cybersecurity services. So it's not free, but it's not it's not for profit. So they just price, whatever it costs in terms of consulting systems, etc., which is potentially more affordable for certain NGOs. But, there's what this points out, if anything, is that the solutions are not straightforward, and that as an NGO, it's not simple to find help just when you need it. And so going back to this idea of planning, you really want as an NGO to have established relationships with cybersecurity providers before anything happens. Whether those are free, at cost, or for profit, you need to have those lines open now.
That was a beautiful wrap-up. Couldn't have put it better myself, Adrien. Thank you very much for that. And thank you guys for being with us today and talking us through this hairy topic.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Thanks, Janne.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and ideas. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe.